My name is Lily. I used to think of myself as ordinary. A woman who could be counted on, who could be loved and who could love back. I learned, the hard way, how little that counts when the person you hand your life to betrays you. I learned to build patience into a weapon and silence into a strategy. This is how I took everything he thought was his, and made it mine. When I first met Mark, he was all soft smiles and indecipherable jokes, a laugh like a promise. He wore gray suits that seemed to know exactly how to catch sunlight, and he had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in every crowded room. I fell for him the way winter melts into spring. Small, steady, almost without complaint. I remember the kitchen in our tiny flat. Chipped paint on the windowsill, a jar of mint he always forgot about, a chipped mug with a spider web of cracks that I loved anyway. We were poor and ridiculous and luminous. We were everything. People assume betrayal is loud, dramatic, angry. For me, it was slow and stupid, a drip that hollowed out my trust until there was only the echo of his footsteps and the stain of his messages. He gave himself away with punctuation, with the way his phone screen made me feel like a thief when it faced down on the table. He became careless. It's almost laughable now that I told myself not to look, that I told myself to trust, that trust had weight enough to crush. But real betrayals are mundane. They smell like perfume and coffee and the small private touches that you think only you have. They look like receipts and late-night calls that stop when you enter a room. I found the first clue, that tiny infuriating human clue, in his jacket pocket. A receipt from a restaurant downtown, dated 3 days after he told me he'd be at his project all night. The receipt was for 2. I told myself excuses for a single afternoon. A single mistake. He called me the next day, voice syrup slow, and when I asked where he'd been he said, at a friend's. I should have demanded clarity. I should have met the other woman with blunt fury. Instead I did something else. I watched. I made myself a student. Of his habits, of his patterns. Of him. I retrained my eyes to notice the small fissures first. When love shuts, attention opens. I observed the way his gait changed when he lied, the way his left thumb fidgeted on the hem of his phone case, the way he always left the bedroom window ajar no matter what season bled through it. At night I lay awake and listened to tiny domestic sounds, a study of where the house kept its shadows. The second clue was a lipstick mark on a coffee cup. It was faint, the color not his type, a deep maroon I had never seen him wear, and I almost threw it away but I kept it. I kept everything. When someone hands you a corner of their life and tucks the rest away, you're allowed to steal it back little by little. I didn't want to ruin him. I wanted to ruin the lie. I wanted him to feel the tremor I'd felt the day I found that receipt, the ache that rippled through me like a sound. People who have never been betrayed imagine the betrayals are all thunderclaps. They are wrong. Betrayal is the slow work of erosion. It disguises itself as routine. I learned to treat it like a math problem. Observe, collect, verify, and only then act. If I had rushed, if I had screamed and clawed and demanded, it would have been messy and temporary. He would have apologized until apology lost its taste and then adapted his next deception to be quieter, smarter. Victory, I realized, required something else. Patience and a cruelty that was surgical. I began by mapping him. His friends, his favorite bar, his email addresses, the little patterns of his lie. I learned to call his colleagues and ask about deadlines, mailing lists, anything that would give me a proper alibi for being curious. I asked gentle questions, the ones wives ask when they practice wedding vows. Did you mean to be late? Is everything okay at work? People are generous when the tone is kind. They answer and spill. A friend of his, Laura, a small, efficient woman with a laugh that tasted of whiskey, told me about a weekend retreat Mark went to, one that changed his approach to leadership. Laura didn't mean to be helpful in the way she was. She simply wanted to be seen as honest. People gave me names because I asked in the way only someone who is not obviously broken can ask. The other woman's name was Elise. She was young in that way that reads as both fresh and entitled. I found her on his social networks first, then traced her to a live-streamed yoga class he'd liked. Elise was practiced in the art of curated sorrowlessness. Her pictures showed travel, sun, and small, fashionable rebellions. She laughed at things in frames he did not. There was nothing dramatic about her, except that she occupied the spaces Mark once reserved for me, and that made her a barometer for my humiliation. I could have confronted her, stared into those curated photographs and smeared them with the kind of rage that feels good and accomplishes nothing. Instead, I began to construct a shape around her life. I found out where she worked, which coffee shop she preferred, the name of her mother from a charity page, and the color of the scarf she wore to a friend's wedding. In the shelter of routine, I developed an intimacy with her details that outstripped any real intimacy I'd had with Mark in months. I need to say something important. I didn't plan to end lives. I planned to end illusions. I wanted to reveal truth with a meticulous hand so that what was left was not revenge for revenge's sake, but a clarity he couldn't walk back from. I needed him to understand, fully irrevocably, what his choices cost him. People mistake resolve for cruelty. Resolve is simply geometry. It requires proportion, measure, and an absence of flinching. I started small. I took his duplicates, keys, cards, the polite identity of a man who has nothing to hide, and I became the careful version of him. In the daylight, I was the woman who made grocery lists and put flowers in a jar near the sink. At night, I put on his cologne and whispered the names of places he loved. I became a ghost with a shopping list. Knowing Elise's routine, I introduced small disturbances. I left anonymous bouquets outside her apartment with notes that were too intimate for her to ignore, notes that suggested knowledge of things only a lover would know. She wrote about them on an account that was everything a young woman could want. Empathetic, slightly wounded, performative. She posted, people liked, and she felt seen for the first time by someone outside herself. That was the first mistake. Then I did what I had watched all my life. I weaponized expectation. I knew that Mark depended on being admired. So I made him watch. I made him watch, invisibly, the collapse of this fantasy he'd been building. I opened accounts, gentle aliases, conversations that smelled like listening. I wrote to Elise as a friend who understood the ache of being in love with someone who was complicated. My messages were tender, the way wounds are tended in secret. Elise answered. She grew less guarded. Her guard became an invitation. At the same time, I rewired Mark's calendar. I educated my way into petty sabotage, making small appointments resurface at inconvenient times, leaving evidence of cancelled dinners, rescheduled meetings. I didn't break anything expensive. I broke trust. He began to miscalculate. He was late to hang out with me on purpose. He lied with the exposure of a man who thought a lie could be a net. The threads he left became ropes I used to tie him. The crucial day, the one that tilted everything toward the center of my design, arrived as a Sunday that smelled of rain. I had been careful to keep my emotions muted, to make myself a lens of reason. But that morning, I found his jacket in a heap on the chair, and inside the pocket, a Polaroid of Elise and him, cheek pressed to cheek, the kind of photograph that writes its own apology later when you consider how intimate it is. I slid the photograph back into the pocket and imagined it was me in the picture. Imagined the curve of my jaw there. Imagined the hot, clean cruelty of being seen. I wanted to be the person who put that Polaroid into his jacket. I wanted to be the hand that unfolded the lie. I had to pace myself, though. The plan required breaks. I began to compose the narrative I would give him when the moment came. Not a brutal scream, but a surgical exposure that would do what my tears could not. Show him how thoroughly I had dismantled his life with nothing but patient observation. He would not see the dismantling as the act of a jealous woman. He would see it as the inevitable consequence of his choices laid bare. If betrayal is a house, I was building it with tools of sun and light. I fed the house evidence. I arranged small, irreproachable moments designed to make him question his capacity for concealment. I printed bank statements with transactions that had the wrong timestamp. I set his social media to show specific interactions between him and Elise that only the gullible would accept as accidental. I left a trail of breadcrumbs that culminated in a single, unavoidable center. The truth. I could have left a note, signed my name with a flourish. It would have been a romantic end. Instead, I did something colder, and more meaningful. I staged a reveal. The evening I chose for the reveal had been nothing special on the calendar, but special in terms of optics. He had a work dinner. I had told him I was staying at a friend's. In truth, I had prepared our apartment like a stage. Photographs, messages, receipts arranged with the tranquility of a morgue. I set out the Polaroids, the swapped calendar entries, the lipstick-stained cup, the receipt from that downtown restaurant. I printed him a single chronological album of his own lies, a small book that read like a confession. When he stepped through the door later than he said, the apartment was quiet except for a soft playlist I'd selected. Songs that had been our soundtrack, the soundtrack I had weaponized by letting it play without him. He called my name and then stopped, because the house was not the place he had left. He noticed the photographs first, the small and precise chaos of them. He laughed, a brittle sound that wanted to be dismissive and failed. "What is this?" he asked. "It's your life," I said. My voice was not loud. It never needed to be. "Do you want me to walk you through it?" He tried to joke, because he preferred comedy when confronted, a skill he had used all his life to slippery effect. He said, "Did you go through my things?" He said it like an accusation, and armor like that is always the first thing a man throws up. "Yes," I said. "I did." His eyes slid to the book. He skimmed the pages, the casualness of a man who expects apologies to be immediate and cheap. His breathing changed when he saw the receipt, when he saw Elise's handwriting on a crumpled napkin, when he saw messages that were time-stamped to a week he had told me he was on site. The syllables of his life fell away like plaster. Lily, listen," he started. "Tell me one thing," I said. "Who am I to you?" He blinked, bewildered by the simplicity of the question. "Your husband," he said, "because that is the easy answer when you think you can return someone like a library book." "You married me because of a joke he told you at a party?" I asked, and it cut him worse than any accusation. He fumbled for a defense and found only denials that sounded like the recitation of instructions from another life. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. What I needed was for him to stand in the wreckage of his own architecture and recognize that I had been the steady hand pulling the strings. I wanted him to feel the nakedness of choice. He tried to bargain in a way I had seen men bargain before, with promises written thin as tissue paper. He said, "I'll end it. I'll stop." "It was a mistake." "Was it?" I asked. "Because I have the receipts. I have the dates. I have everything you thought you hid just by being careless." He looked at me then, not as a spouse, not as a friend, but as a man who needed containment. The irony of this, him wanting to be contained, was not lost on me. He had spent months freeing himself from obligations that made him feel small, and now he sought smallness. He wanted shelter from the storm he'd started. In the weeks that followed, he begged in that bored, petulant way men tend to beg when they are surprised the safety net is no longer there. He apologized, more than once. Apologies come in a man's voice like a thin rain that soaks nothing. He promised therapy, devotion, radical transparency. But his language was all performance, the same language you use to get out of speeding tickets and broken contracts. I had learned not to trust language that wasn't backed by action. So I escalated. Not with violence, not even with spectacle, but with a final act of arithmetic. I started with his reputation. Men like Mark lived as much on admiration as they did on loyalty. They wore success like perfume. I took that away from him in places he cared about. I contacted his firm, not with the outrage of someone scorned but with the clear corporate complaints of someone who had evidence. I sent emails that read like risk assessments, with attachments and dates and carefully redacted conversations. I called a client whose name Mark mentioned once, a woman who would listen to a story where credibility is currency. I told the truth, precisely and unemotionally. The firm's HR, the clients, the colleagues, they responded the way systems respond to water in the basement, with alarm and investigations. There's an odd thing about systems when you push them. They do not ask why as much as they ask how and when. They want facts. I gave them facts. I never used threats, only documents. In the polite language of bureaucracy, Mark imploded. Offers were rescinded. Projects he counted on evaporated. He became a man with fewer places to go where people would trust him. It was not a pretty victory. He had real consequences. The muting of opportunity, polite dismay from friends, a sliding away of people who had liked him for what he promised rather than who he had been. I watched the changes happen not with satisfaction the size of malice but with a kind of academic interest. I had laid out variables on a table and watched the reaction. Of course, there are people who would call what I did monstrous. They would say I had no right. They would shout about forgiveness and the sanctity of human mistakes. I will not argue with them, because vengeance is a private language and its grammar varies. But I will say this, the man who hurt me had the power to change and refused it. He chose a deception that swallowed our life. He made choices. The consequences were not an invention. They were proportional. He tried to rebuild. He came to me in the middle of the aftermath with a lamplight of contrition, hands open as though asking for alms. He wanted to be forgiven the way one wants a scratch smoothed out, quickly and with little fuss. I could have taken him back. Perhaps I would have, under different circumstances. But he had already borrowed what could not be returned. Our life had lost shape the way a house loses a roof in a storm. I could not pretend to be surprised by the collapse. The real turning point, the part of the story that people will remember as the murder of his ego, came when Elise left. I had cultivated her trust for months, written myself into her need for being heard, and then I withdrew like a tide that goes out slow and takes small shells with it. I told her what she needed to hear, that Mark had been dishonest, that she deserved more than being someone's line item. I did not try to destroy her. I tried to direct her away from him, to reroute her life from the path of the man who had given her a trophy instead of a partner. She left with luggage and a face that looked like someone trying to remember how to be whole. There was a delicious cruelty in that small exit. She had been his escape route, a mirror he could admire when the marriage got heavy. But she could not hold him through the storms he made for himself. I watched as the person who had replaced me broke under the pressure of being an accessory to betrayal. Elise drove away one bright morning, her taillights receding like punctuation. Mark's attempt to salvage what remained failed because the people he deceived were not interested in being extras in his redemption arc. There are things you cannot script. People's responses are not your property. He had loaned his truth to a perfidy that returned it mangled, and he could not get it back. In the end, the last scene of our marriage was not a grand cinematic confrontation but a quiet, bureaucratic unfurling. We split what life had left like two accountants dividing a stale pie. There were forms and signatures, and the intimacy between us by then felt like a transaction that had never been honest. He left, smaller than he had been, carrying just enough of our life to make his departure bearable. I stood in the doorway after he left and breathed in the apartment that felt, for the first time in years, like mine. There was no celebration, no triumphal music. There was only a cold, steady satisfaction, the kind that comes from solving a problem you did not deserve to have to solve. I had taken the most dangerous thing a person can have, their certainty, and shown him how easily it could be dismantled when misused. I do not tell this story to boast. I tell it because we are raised to believe that vulnerability is a weakness, but vulnerability is only dangerous when paired with gullibility. The strength I found was not in vengeance for its own sake. It was in the slow, unwavering undoing of a lie. I learned a brutal lesson. For every action you take to conceal, there is a reaction that can expose you. I used the tools I had, patience, observation, a talent for quiet infiltration, and I turned them into a reckoning. There are nights I still dream of his face, and of the way things used to be before the fissure formed and widened. Sometimes I imagine a life in which he never strayed and we grew old in that chipped kitchen with the jar of mint he always forgot. Sometimes I imagine myself the woman I could have been without the lesson of hurt. Softer, perhaps, less cunning, certainly. But those dreams are like childhood houses. They are not where I live now. What I have now is a life reconstructed with the careful architecture of someone who knows the weight of choices. I move through it differently. I do not hand my trust away for the sake of a laugh. I keep my keys in a pocket that is mine alone. I buy new mugs, and when a new man enters my life, I test him with questions that are small and ordinary, because I have learned the difference between performance and root. I keep receipts and I keep my distance until evidence convinces me otherwise. If you ask whether I am happier now, I will not lie. There is a quiet joy in being whole after being broken. There is also a shadow that whispers of the cost. But I would rather be whole and wary than naive and bruised. The victory I won was not about winning him back or watching him suffer. It was about reclaiming myself from someone who treated me as if I could be replaced with a photo and a lipstick mark. I wanted to see what remained when the lie was taken away. I wanted to know whether I could survive the truth. I did more than survive. I planned, I executed, and I watched a life rearrange itself into something that could contain me without charming me into silence. People will read this and say whatever they say about revenge. They will speak of grace and mercy like currencies I squandered. Let them. They do not know what it is to have your most honest self stolen under a thin tarp of casualness. I am Lily. I once loved a man named Mark. I once lost myself to his laughter, to his plausible explanations. I took the slow road because the quick road is often a mirage. I learned that triumph does not require spectacle. It requires patience, evidence, and the willingness to do the practical, not the theatrical. I did not make him pay for the sake of punishment. I made him face what he had chosen. And in the cold, bright aftermath, I learned to trust myself again. If there is a moral to this story, and I am not certain I believe in tidy morals, it is this: do not confuse kindness for weakness. Watch the small things because they accumulate into meaning. When someone betrays you, you can scream or you can solve. There is bravery in both. And I am not here to judge which is nobler. I only know what I had, and what I took back. My life, my dignity, my peace. The apartment is quieter now. The jar of mint has been replaced with a pot of rosemary. I leave the window open in the mornings because wind is honest. It tells you when it has passed. I keep one photograph. Not of Mark, but of a wild shore where I once stood and decided I would not be a victim of my own softness. Sometimes I sit there and write lists of things I will never give again. Unquestioned trust, unquestioned forgiveness without action, the right to be surprised by someone's duplicity. I have learned to defend those things with attention. Mark is a memory, folded into the shoebox of my life. He taught me how fragile certainty can be. Revenge taught me where my courage lives. Both lessons are part of the person who steps out each day into the thin, incandescent light of the city. I am not vengeful by nature. But when someone carves out a piece of you for himself and offers it to the world as a trinket, you have the right, the implicit right, to take back what is yours. I took it back with the slow geometry of patience, with the arithmetic of evidence. I won not because I wanted to hurt but because I wanted the truth to be visible. I won because I refused to be a footnote in someone else's archive of good deeds. I won because I learned how to be careful, and how to make care lethal to falsehood. That is all. My name is Lily, and I survived.